Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the major news of the day, and that is the normalization of ties between Bahrain and Israel. Now, Bahrain, not too long ago, had in fact said that it would not normalize ties with Israel in the wake of the normalization of ties between the United Arab Emirates and Israel as well. Nevertheless, something obviously has changed behind the scenes, and Bahrain has now decided to normalize ties with Israel. That announcement came yesterday from Washington, D.C., and from the White House, initially through Donald Trump's tweet, and then there was an official statement put out, a joint statement that is between the U.S., Israel, and the Kingdom of Bahrain as well about that normalization of ties. Now, what exactly is happening behind the scenes at this point in time that is pushing, or that has pushed, I should say, the likes of the UAE and Bahrain to make these decisions in such fairly quick succession, right? Because this comes just less than 29 days, or give or take, between the UAE decision and now the Bahrain decision. So this seemingly is something that's happened behind the scenes that is encouraging these countries to do this at this point in time. Let's put all of those issues now to our guests who are joining us today. We're joined by Mehdi Eliefifi, who is a member of the U.S. Democratic Party. He's also a political analyst. He's joining us this morning from New York. Joining us from London is Dr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen, who is with the UN Institute for Training and Research. He's also the author of The Privatization of Warfare. And joining us from Ramallah is Dr. Mustafa, who is a Palestinian politician. Dr. Barghouti, Dr. Due-Gundersen, and Mehdi, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Dr. Barghouti, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What are your thoughts about this? I mean, as I said in my introduction there, this is in fairly quick succession, right, where the UAE and now Bahrain have made this decision. What do you think is happening that's encouraged them to do this?
It's unfortunately these governments have were subjected to terrible pressure from the United States and Israel, and their normalization agreements are contradictory to the necessity of approaching peace, contrary to what they say, that this is an agreement for peace. All in all, it is not only about normalization, it's about adopting the American-Israeli plan, which is called the deal of the century, and I should call it the deceit of the century, because it aims at liquidating all the Palestinian rights. It departs from the original peace process, which was based on land for peace. And it is a plan written by Netanyahu that will transform the idea of Palestinian freedom and statehood into clusters of ghettos and pentostans in a system that is worse than apartheid in South Africa. They say that it's a peace agreement, but neither Bahrain nor Emirates had a fight with Israel or had a war. Actually, they have wars in Yemen, and they have wars in Libya, and they have problems with Qatar. So if they want to speak about peace and normalization, they should start with their domestic problems and their involvement in these areas.
Yeah.
So with Israel, the problem is with Palestinians, not with the Emiratis or the Bahrainis. And in my opinion, this is an overall approach to distract the attention of the world from the real problem, which is the Palestinian issue. To distract the attention of the world from the fact that there is a military occupation that is the longest in modern history, more than 52 years. And it's a system of apartheid that nobody should accept. In my opinion, these agreements will change nothing. They will only make Israel more aggressive, and they are meant to help Trump, who is afraid of losing elections, and Netanyahu, who is encountering 4 major court cases for corruption.
Yeah. Nicolai, your thoughts on this? Because one of the things that was, if I may call it refreshing, is probably not the right term to use here, but I'll use it anyhow. One of the Bahraini officials, that his name escapes me right now, said that essentially the decision on the part of his country was in its own national interest. And that's probably the first time that these countries are being honest, right? Where, there's been this narrative of, oh, we're doing this to further peace for the Palestinians as well. We're doing this to help our Palestinian brothers, but that narrative seems to now be breaking down, right? Where the Emiratis used that initially when they first came out with that normalization of ties news. Why can't these countries just be honest and say, listen, we're doing it for our own national interests and we've sort of just sidelined the Palestinian cause? I mean, that's the honest truth, isn't it?
I think that, to be honest with you, for a while now, the issue of Palestinian occupation has become a side issue for many of these countries in the Gulf. and it really comes down to national interest. So Bahrain, let's remember, they are a major U.S. ally, along with the UAE and Saudi, of course. They want to get closer to Washington. They host the U.S. Navy's regional headquarters as well. Let's also remember that since roughly 1994, Bahrain has actually had some ties to Israel, including intelligence contacts. There was a leak about this in 2005, in which Bahrain admitted that they had contact with Mossad. So we now see, I think, an emphasis on national interest across the Gulf to counter perceived threats by Iran. And to counter the so-called Shia crescent. And let's remember that Bahrain does have a significant Shia populace, and this is one of the fears that is played on by various actors, this idea that Iran somehow has its own desire to push its view of religion onto the Gulf states.
Mehdi, what are your thoughts on this from your vantage point there? I mean, the U.S. obviously, I mean, it's quite obvious what the U.S. president gains from this, right? He gains the sort of, bragging rights to say, oh, I brought peace between, Israel and these GCC countries. But no one's really thinking of the Palestinians in this process, I would imagine.
As a proud Muslim and Arab, I echo what your guests from London have said. I saw this coming since the visit of President Trump to Riyadh and the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. I think the lack of the involvement of the Arab and Muslim countries and the reaction that the U.S. administration got from those Muslim countries pushed them to put aside anything that have to do with the Palestinian. Plus, they always blame the division within the different Palestinian faction on that they don't have a specific group to talk with, and the Palestinians have their own issues. The reality is Donald Trump wanted to save his presidency. He have not done anything literally in the Middle Eastern process or the peace agreement. And even with any foreign country, he have failures with China, failures with North Korea, failures in everywhere that he tried to. And the best ally that he have is Netanyahu. So he figured out that if he can push those countries who have already have ties with Israel long time ago, maybe it's not official, but it's very well known that the U.S. and Emirates was always in contact with Israel. Bahrain and other Arab countries also has been in contact with Israel in many, many levels. It was a good time, especially with the polls right now not in his favor, to present something as an achievement, a historic achievement in terms of the peace agreement, what is called the peace agreement, without even looking at the Palestinian at all. Arab countries in their own behalf, they sell this to the Arab and Muslim countries that it is a peace agreement in their best interest. But the reality is the Palestinian issue now took a backseat with every Arab country that you can imagine.
Dr. Barghouti, one of the interesting things that came out of this normalization of ties between Bahrain and Israel, right as the news had come out, I noticed on Twitter that there were a couple of hashtags trending about, essentially, an Arab, one of them was in Arabic and the other in English, about essentially saying that, this was betrayal on the part of Bahrain, and even Bahrainis seemingly were tweeting against this sort of decision. Do you get the feeling, Dr. Barghouti, that the Arab street itself is not in agreement with these respective governments and their decisions?
Absolutely. Actually, what we didn't see in the case of the Emirates, we are seeing now in the case of Bahrain. Because Bahrain has an oppressed but rather strong civil society. They have an oppressed but rather strong political forces. And you can see all over the social media a very big Bahraini protest against this act that was taken. And it shows that what we always said is correct. The Arab peoples are with the Palestinians. Some of the governments are not. And in this case, they are playing a very, very dangerous game even for their own people because they underestimate the Israeli aggressive behavior and the Israeli aim of dominating the whole region. Israel considers itself in competition with Turkey and with Iran, and they try to dominate the Arab region on the basis of this conflict. In reality, we have no problem with Iran, we have no problem with Turkey, we have a problem with Israel. And the Arabs are threatened by Israel. And I don't mean only the Palestinians. Israel conspired for a very long time against Egypt in the case of the Nile water. Israel conspired against Sudan. Israel conspired against Iraq. Actually, Israel aggravated the attack on Iraq, the American attack on Iraq. So practically, these countries are really inviting a very aggressive enemy into their house. And in my opinion, they will pay a very high price for that. But regarding Mr. Trump and his claim that he's achieving peace, I think his behavior is like the behavior of a bad student who has an examination in math. He receives a difficult problem, and in this case, the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Instead of solving the problem, he goes to another problem which has nothing to do with the exam, and then claims that he's making peace. There is no meaning of this peace between Emirates or Bahrainis. The problem is between Palestinians and Israelis. The occupation is against Palestinians. The system of apartheid is not against Bahrainis, it's against Palestinians.
Indeed. You know, Nicolai, right as that news had come out, in fact, about the normalization of ties between the Emiratis and the Israelis, there was news, wasn't there, about Emiratis being arrested, those who actually came out against that normalization of ties as well. You know, and I haven't heard news yet regarding that when it comes to Bahrain, but I imagine that that may possibly happen in Bahrain as well if somebody were to, you know, quite strongly speak out either via social media or otherwise against this normalization of ties. You know, does that again go to show that you know, the Arab street is not necessarily in line with these governments' policies?
This is a very good point. And here we have to look at two aspects. We have to look at the regimes having credibility with their own people versus the regimes having credibility with Washington. And I do think that since Trump started to endorse, for example, the Golan Heights and the notion that Jerusalem is a part of Israel, it may have emboldened regimes to start to shake hands with Israel more openly because they want to be secure, and also they want Washington to listen to them, to have better access to Washington. When it comes to the Arab street itself, I think that some of these regimes, they will have no qualms whatsoever with suppressing their own people if necessary, but they're doing things twofold. On the one hand, we do have reports of some leaderships turning to social influencers in their own countries and paying them to basically say, let's support Israel publicly, so they have the image of normalization being okay. We also have reports that, for example, in the Emirates, there's a Palestinian diaspora. There's about 100,000 Palestinians living in the Emirates, and some of them have faced issues of deportation in the past for speaking out against the Emirati government. So I'm assuming that the Emirates and other Gulf states feel comfortable enough to do stuff like that, to engage in such tactics in order to normalize relations with Israel so that they have better access to Washington and can have a different security pact for the region.
So Mehdi, it essentially comes down to, for me as well, right, that from day one when it came to this deal of the century as it was presented to all of us and the Palestinians, was that, you know, that it seems that the Trump administration and these other countries are essentially trying to force something down the throats of, be it the Arab street or the Palestinians, right? And that won't work, will it?
The problem I see is that because of the aggression of Iran, it did give the U.S. leverage over all these countries. You got to understand, in the past few years, Iran have expanded in Iraq. It's affecting Lebanon in a big time. It's affecting Yemen. Now it's also affecting those regimes in the Gulf area. There is a big population of Shia in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia and in the UAE and in Bahrain. So what's happening here is that those regimes are afraid from the expansion of Iran. Iran is aggressively expanding in the region. The U.S. is taking the advantage of the lack of the support in any kind of peace agreement that can be really done with the Palestinian, and they taking advantage of the division within the Palestinian community and the different faction, different groups of Palestinian, and using this for their own leverage. The Trump administration, for example, since its inception, they have in front of them to move the embassy to Jerusalem, to work very closely with Israel. This is the most aggressive administration we've seen when it comes to dealing with Israel. On the other hand, the Arab governments in the Gulf, for example, they want to make sure that they have a good relation with the U.S. because of the threats that Iran have exerted over them and what have happened in Zahran, for example, and that this threat gave those government the reason to go and work with the U.S. in whatever kind of agreement, even though we all know that the Arab street does not accept this kind of agreement, but those regimes and those governments want to make sure that they have an alliance with the U.S. just in case if something happened with Iran, they have somebody to work with.
Dr. Burke, as a final comment, I wanted to ask you, just within Palestinians themselves, right? I would imagine that the realization has always been there that it will have to be Palestinians themselves who ensure their own interests, but that must now be, even more solidified now, considering that we've had these countries now normalizing ties with Israel and essentially in quote-unquote betraying the Palestinians, as even Hanan Ashrawi and others have said. Do you think that this will now ensure unity, which has been long needed anyways amongst the Palestinian factions?
It must. We cannot afford any internal division anymore. And our internal unity is decisive in making us able to encounter the Trump's and Netanyahu's plans and to ensure the rights of the Palestinian people in the future. So all our efforts are now directed at creating a unified Palestinian leadership, at bridging the internal division and ending it, and to have a unified strategy. But that also requires some kind of revision, actually, of old beliefs. I personally think that the Zionist movement and Israel have decided that they don't want a compromise with Palestinians. They want all of Palestine. And that is the meaning of what Netanyahu said, peace for peace rather than land for peace. The whole idea of two-state solution is dying. And I think this should push us in two directions. First of all, our unity. And second, we should consolidate our understanding that we are not only struggling against a system of occupation in West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, but actually to bring down the whole system of apartheid that is practiced in the whole of historic Palestine against our brothers inside Israel, against Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, and against Palestinians in the diaspora who are prevented from coming home. I think there is a need for reforming our approach to include the struggle against the system of apartheid. And regarding the Arab countries, we have learned long time ago that we have to rely on ourselves. We have very painful memories about the failure of Arab countries in 1948, in 1967, in 1982, in 2002, when Sharon responded to the Arab Peace Initiative by invading every town and every village in West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah.
We all remember that, and we know that we have to rely on ourselves. But it is actually disappointing to see some Arab countries go in this path, which is harmful to us and harmful to their peoples.
Very well. We'll leave those word, but we appreciate all three of our guests. That was Drs. Barghouti and Due-Gundersen, who was speaking to us there from London and Ramallah, respectively. And we were also joined with Mehdi and Eliefifi, who was speaking to us this morning from New York. And they're sharing their thoughts there on this news that has come out of the normalization of ties between Israel and the Kingdom of Bahrain. What exactly is happening behind the scenes that we've had the likes of the UAE and now Bahrain in fairly quick succession normalizing ties with Israel. The kind of pressure, as Dr. Barghouti there mentioned, that has been brought upon these countries of the Persian Gulf by the Americans as well as the Israelis, we would probably understand has been quite strong behind the scenes to ensure that this does happen, both for Trump's own need to deflect away from criticism, possibly of his handling of coronavirus and other many such issues within his country. And of course, even Netanyahu himself, as Dr. Barghouti also laid out, has a fairly significant number of criminal cases against him. So both of those Western, quote-unquote, leaders needed a deflection, a distraction, which would give them a victory of some sort in their own respective people's eyes. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. Now, you're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and in this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. elections. So we've been discussing that for a while now about mail-in ballots, etc. But what of the candidates themselves and Americans' opinions on the both of them? Because, you know, it seems that we've gotten stuck into this very polarized view about Biden versus Trump, Democrats versus Republicans, BLM versus, you know, the other side, etc., etc. But it's also important to see or understand exactly what Americans' views are on Biden and Trump, sort of together in a sense, because that sort of is also indicative of what Americans are feeling going into these elections, isn't it? A new poll, a CNBC Change Research poll, has said that in 6 swing states, and we know that swing states specifically are those states where presidential candidates have always tried to campaign really, really hard to ensure that they can win in those specific states because they have the most influence over the Electoral College, etc. In those swing states, a 51% majority have said that Trump is mentally unfit to be president, and 52% have said that Biden is mentally unfit to be president. Now, as far as them being physically fit, everyone agrees that they can be president when it comes to that regard. But what does this then say about these candidates and the quality of candidates? Because even in the previous elections, there was a debate, wasn't there, in many quarters about Clinton and whether or not she was genuinely a good candidate, beyond the fact that she was a female candidate. And that in and of itself, yes, was extremely important to have somebody, a woman standing up as a presidential candidate, be it on the Democrat side or the Republican side. But beyond that, there was also then this debate about the quality of the candidate herself, as well as, of course, just Donald Trump himself and the controversy surrounding him. So let's discuss all of that a bit further with our guests who are joining us this morning. We're joined now by Dr. Brandon W. Lenoir, who is an assistant professor of political science and strategic communication at High Point University. He researches voter behavior and political communication. He's joining us from High Point, North Carolina. Joining us from Holliston, Massachusetts is Frank Sobchak, who is a PhD candidate in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's also taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and Tufts University. He attained the rank of colonel before retiring after a 26-year career in the U.S. Army. Frank and Brandon, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Frank, let me start with you. What does such a poll say to you? I mean, it's worrying in some senses, is it not, that Americans would have such a fairly low opinion of both candidates?
Good morning, Waqar. Thank you for having me on. So I think first it's important to note that I am not a doctor. I'm not able to kind of determine whether or not they're mentally fit for duty based on a medical perspective. That said, I am a student and have been a student of the U.S. political system for a considerable amount of time. And so I think we're able to weigh in on how the American polity will reflect on that. And quite frankly, in my opinion, I don't think this is going to have a significant impact one way or the other. I think this for kind of 2 reasons. First is that the United States has kind of had a long history of, frankly, accepting or having candidates who hide their medical history, and as well as accepting candidates who have kind of questions or issues about their medical history, whether it be from in 1919, when President Wilson suffered a stroke during his second term, and that was kind of concealed. Effectively, his wife was serving as the executive, whether it be Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his history with polio and concealment of him being in a wheelchair, John F. Kennedy with his history having been injured in the PT-109 incident and taking lots of medicine, painkillers for his back, or even President Ronald Reagan, who, interestingly enough, is 1 year younger than President Trump when he was elected to his first term. Right. Lots of speculation in his second term about whether or not he had Alzheimer's. So I think it's really important to note that in U.S. polity, kind of questions like this oftentimes are not decisive, in my opinion.
Interesting. Brandon, again, obviously looking at this from the outside in, but to me, it just seems like it seems odd, doesn't it, to have 2 candidates, and both of them sort of, again, I'm just generalizing here big time, don't seem to really excite either side that much. I mean, to the extent that they would see them both as mentally unfit. I mean, that's not exactly, an endorsement that anyone wants.
Well, we have to remember that oftentimes when we are at this stage of a presidential campaign, it's not uncommon for the average American to be dissatisfied with both candidates. They both have torn into each other. They both have been putting each other down. The issue of mental acuity has been brought up because of Donald Trump's trip to Walter Reed Medical Center and some of his gaffes. And he has turned some of the criticism and speculation about his mental acuity onto Joe Biden. But there's some risks with trying to go after Joe Biden for his mental acuity because it's almost code for being too old for the office. And we have to remember that the bulk of the electorate that will be turning out to vote are 50 years and older. And many of the people who are going to vote might be offended by the code of saying that Joe Biden is too old to run for office. So there are pitfalls with the strategies of both campaigns going after the mental acuity or fitness for office of each of the candidates, given that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are only separated by 3 years in age.
Frank, if you feel that this is sort of like a distraction and deflection from the real issues, right? Because there are some very serious, important issues, as there always are in every U.S. presidential elections or any elections anywhere in the world. There are always important issues to discuss. I mean, the mental health certainly is important, but to me it feels like we're sort of just throwing mud for the sake of throwing mud at each other.
I do think that that's a factor, and I do think that's part of the strategy, for example, that President Trump is employing. There was a lot of this, in my opinion, also came about after the West Point visit, where he seemed to have trouble navigating a ramp, as well as drinking a glass of water with one hand or two hands. That he kind of shows this tendency to go on the offense whenever there are any questions kind of raised against him. So it does reflect that kind of past history of trying to throw mud, trying to go on the offensive rather than trying to address the issues at hand.
And Brandon, I'll give a word before I let the both of you go. On this issue, again, of just throwing mud, I mean, do you feel this is a distraction, or do you think this is actually an important conversation to have? Because, again, on the other side, I mean, the argument can be, okay, these are going to be, one of these two men, again, will have access to, vast power of, for example, taking the country to war if need be, et cetera.
Well, I think on some levels it can be a distraction. It's taking away from the actual positions that each of the candidates stand on. But I think that with the debate about the mental fitness of the two people at the top of the ticket, that draws a little bit more attention to who is running as vice president. It's going to make people question whether Kamala Harris or Mike Pence are ready for the job in the event that they have to step in. So perhaps this election cycle will make the vice presidential debate and the vice presidential candidates more significant in the electoral process than they have been in years past.
Very interesting. At that with Frank and Brandon, but we sincerely appreciate both of their times this morning, speaking to us from High Point, North Carolina, and Holliston in Massachusetts, respectively, sharing their thoughts, of course, on Donald Trump versus Joe Biden and their mental fitness or lack of on the part of Americans. I'll be back continuing this discussion after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're continuing the discussion right now about the mental fitness of Donald Trump as well as Joe Biden going into these elections at the end of this year in November. And of course, that poll, that CNBC Change Research poll, which shows a 51% majority saying Trump is mentally unfit to be president, as well as 52% saying Biden is also mentally unfit to be president. Now that, at least from the outside, it seems worrying, but the previous guest that we had said that this is not completely shocking in the sense that there have been past debates about previous presidents also and their mental health in the past also. So let me put this issue now to two new panelists who are joining us to discuss this further. We're now joined by Joseph Williams, who is senior news editor at U.S. News and World Report. He covers national trends as well. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Joining us this morning from New York is Vincent Vernuccio, who is the president of the American Analysis of News and Media Incorporated. He has served previously in Democrat and Republican administrations. Frank and Joseph, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Joseph, let me start with you. How big a deal is this, the mental fitness of any president in sitting in office, an incumbent and or somebody who wants to be president?
It's important. How big a deal is remains to be seen. I mean, certainly with Donald Trump, we've seen some of his erratic behavior, and a lot of it has been worrying. I mean, we've seen him stumble down a ramp. We've heard some of the things that he said. He tends to meander when he talks. So clearly, we've got real-time examples, and more than one of Donald Trump not necessarily being as mentally acute as we'd like our presidents to be. Joe Biden, on the other hand, I think the poll is a reflection of Trump's ability so far to frame Biden as mentally unfit, because we're having an unusual campaign in an unusual year. Normally, at this stage, we'd see big rallies. Joe Biden would probably be on television a lot more than he is, and he'd be giving speeches to crowds. And we don't have that this year, mostly because of the pandemic. Now, Trump is framing Biden, and Trump is also framing himself. But I think the big difference here is that we haven't had them going head to head. I think the debates may change some of that polling, change some of those polling numbers. But as it stands right now, we've got one candidate who's known for his gaffes, and we've got an incumbent who has been known for kind of erratic behavior and strange speech. So all in all, I think it will clarify a little bit, but to me, it's kind of peak 2020. I mean, we have an unusual campaign in an unusual year, in unusual circumstances, so we may as well have an unusual poll with an unusual result.
But what are your thoughts about this? Because at least, again, from the outside in, I'm not speaking as an American, certainly, it seems that it should be concerning to the average American that if we are doubting the quality of both sides' candidates, then that says something, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that worrying? Shouldn't we need very strong leadership at this very sensitive time for the country?
Well, certainly, as Joseph noted, during a presidential campaign, both sides will level charges against each other. The question is, how substantive are those charges actually? In the case of President Trump, we've known since 2016, when he first announced his candidacy, that he does not speak like a conventional politician. He's neither a lawyer nor someone who's been in elective office before. What some might describe as erratic attitude in his speech is actually someone who is different in dealing with the public. He does not sound like a lawyer. He does not sound like a politician. And I don't think that can really be taken as evidence that he is in any way mentally unfit. On the other hand, with Joe Biden, we've had a 47-year relationship with Joe Biden in the United States government, and we know that his love of communicating with the public does seem to be shortchanged during this presidential election. He's an avid campaigner, but has failed to campaign so far this year, other than a few rather questionable interviews from his own basement. His reluctance to appear in public, his use apparently of a teleprompter, his refusal to engage in spontaneous questioning certainly is worrisome and something the public has taken note of.
You know, again, as I'd put to Frank, you know, this is a sensitive time for the country and for the world, certainly, as we can all agree upon, I imagine, because of the pandemic and various other such geopolitical issues also. You know, these are men, or one of these men at least, will have access again to the likes of the nuclear code and other such powers that a U.S. president wields to, for example, wage war in defense of his, you know, homeland, et cetera, et cetera. All of that just seems overwhelmingly scary, at least from the outside. And again, if you have somebody in office who is mentally unfit, I mean, I know that there are safeguards in place. Are those safeguards enough to ensure that nothing would go wrong?
One would hope. I mean, basically, one of the things that we've learned over the Donald Trump presidency is that a lot of the safeguards and norms aren't necessarily fail-safe. I mean, think about all the norms that President Trump has shattered. From self-dealing and from having his children serve in his own cabinet to things like diplomacy, where he is meeting with Kim Jong-un with no preconditions, and he's espousing how much they get along really well. I mean, those are things that a normal politician does not do. And I agree that he is an unconventional one. And I think that we've also had people who have been serving in the administration who have seen him up close on a day-to-day basis, who have talked about how he might not necessarily have the acuity and how his behavior can be troublesome. So it's not just a matter of image making and seeing him in public. It's a matter of people who have actually served with him who kind of question whether or not he is fit for the office. I mean, we had a recent book come out by several journalists who have said the same thing in interviews with members of the Trump administration. We've had our own eyes see what we've seen in the way that he is comporting himself. And yes, I agree that he is not a conventional politician, but we do want people who can at least communicate in an effective manner. Now, that is not to say that Biden has not had his struggles. I mean, keep in mind that he's also had an aneurysm, a couple of them, I think, over the course of his political career. And it is worrisome. I mean, I am extremely worried that we've got two septuagenarians, guys in their 70s, running for the most powerful office in the world. You want somebody who's sharp. You want somebody who's quick on their feet. And we don't necessarily have that in these two candidates. But here we are.
Frank, I'll give you the word before I let both of you go. Does this mean, Frank, in some way that we should then be giving that much more importance to the quality of the vice presidential candidates? So what are your thoughts about Pence versus Harris?
Well, Kamala Harris's reputation in California, of course, has been one of a very popular senator. But I just want to go back to the important point.
Sure.
In deciding the mental fitness of a candidate, whether you're talking about president or Senate or a congressman, you have to look at consistency over the years. President Trump has been consistent in his behavior and consistent in the way he speaks. Again, it's unconventional, but it's consistent with his own past. In the case of Joe Biden, we see a substantial break with his past actions and his past methods of dealing with the public, and that is the most worrisome factor.
All right, well, that is our final word, but we appreciate both Frank and Joseph for their time this morning, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. and New York, respectively, sharing their thoughts, as our previous guests, Brandon and Frank, as well did, from Washington, from High Point, and Holliston, Massachusetts. Now, we've discussed the quality of these candidates, right, the mental fitness quality, because that's important. You can't just have somebody in power who is mentally unfit for the position. Nevertheless, there are safeguards in place. It's not like the U.S. president can himself or herself completely make decisions alone. There is a certain process that has to be followed, which Donald Trump, mind you, has not always followed. But does this then come down to, as Brandon, I believe, had said, it comes down to the vice presidential candidates, that we then need to look at that second in command in some ways, who things would fall back on if, God forbid, something were to happen to the president or the presidential candidate themselves. What about Harris versus Pence? Who is better? Who is more fit for office, physically as well as mentally? Both, of course, have long experience within political office and within the establishment there in the United States. So maybe that is a conversation that needs to be had as well. Maybe the vice presidential debates will be that much more important going into these elections, because these are two, as Joseph there had said, fairly old men going into this office. Again, it's not an ageist argument. It's just a question of the fact that their mental health, as proven by medical records and concerns about hospital visits, show at this point in time. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.